I remember responding to the call. It was 9:48 at night, in the middle of nowhere, but we still had to respond to it. It was technically in our district. My partner got in the cruiser with his cup of coffee, and we took off to show to this call. For what we understood from dispatch, this was a home invasion and a possible homicide. We drove to the call, which took us 30 minutes, which was on this old country road with little to no streetlights. We drove with our lights on and our siren blaring. I couldn't help but notice how isolated this location was the closer we got to the call. We finally reached the call's driveway. The driveway itself was gravel and was just under a mile long. We drove down to the end of the driveway and saw 2 trucks with their doors open and their high beams on, facing the farmhouse. None of the lights were on in the house. On the ground in front of the home was a man missing his lower half, squirming in pain. A woman who appeared to be his wife was comforting the man on the ground while she was crying hysterically. Despite her back facing us, we could tell that her shirt was covered in blood. I exited the cruiser with my gun drawn while being baffled at the sight that lay before me. The wife was clutching a phone while pointing to the open door to the farmhouse. "What happened here?" I said in a confused horror. "It's not human," she sobbed, pointing to the dark abyss of her once peaceful home. I looked up to see the home's windows mostly shattered and a blood trail coming from the inside to what remained of the man in the driveway. My partner went to the woman and escorted her back to the cruiser while calling for backup. I grabbed my flashlight and entered the home slowly. I tried the lights, but nothing. My flashlight provided a cone of artificial light as I slowly examined the house. I continued to follow the blood trail, mainly out of morbid curiosity, but also to see what had done this to that man. My gun was partially raised as I slowly walked through the house, following the blood trail. The blood trail got thicker with more clumps of meat and flesh as I finally realized where it was leading me. It was leading me to the basement. The main reason for this call was that there's an intruder inside the home. There was a very good possibility that the intruder was still inside. I thought back to earlier to what the woman was saying. It's not human. What could she have meant by that? I opened the door to the basement and peered down. The trail of blood was thicker than before. The blood was so much that it could not have belonged to the same person. There was a good chance that there was someone else here that was injured. I called down the stairs, making my presence known, and told them to come out with their hands up. This was mainly so I didn't have to go down the stairs by myself. I heard shuffling coming from inside the basement, and a cry for help. "Ah, great," I whispered to myself. Being a man of action, I wasn't going to wait for backup to go down the stairs and potentially save someone from a life-threatening situation. I gripped my gun and my flashlight tighter and made my way down slowly. Each step I made down into the darkness, a part of me regretted coming down here more and more. My light shined on the blood trail on the floor, and the trail of blood took an odd turn. It appeared that the trail went up the side of the wall and onto the ceiling. I started to shake. Once I made it to the bottom of the basement, I called out again, and I got a response. "Help me," whimpered from under the stairs I was just walking on. I shined my flashlight under the stairs, and I saw a girl there. She had a dark hoodie on with many piercings on her face. I called my partner on the walkie, saying that I have someone else that needs assistance. I kept my gun trained on her. I wasn't sure if she was a threat or not, and I asked her some questions. "What's going on? Who are you?" She had her head face down and she was shivering. "Please help me," she said. "We didn't actually think it was real," she sobbed through her hands. Her hands were covering her eyes, but they seemed to be bleeding. "Can you look at me?" I asked her. She shook her head. "I can't. The creature, it took my eyes." She turned her face upwards and I could see dark red holes where her eyes should have been. My jaw dropped, and I almost dropped my light. "Where is this thing?" I said frantically. "I don't know. It still needs parts. I think it's still down here," she cried. "Parts? For what?" At that moment, I heard something behind me. I turned my light and my gun to see something move in the corner of the basement. What was I dealing with? I noticed that the basement wasn't finished. There were these plastic sheets dividing it into what I assumed to be future rooms. I made my way through the basement slowly. I noticed that body parts were clumped in small red mounds of what appeared to be multiple people. I walked up to the sheet that I thought I saw movement behind. I moved it slowly. Behind it, I could see a large person wearing a robe hunched over in the middle of the floor. "Hands up, now!" My gun and flashlight were trained on the figure. My adrenaline was pumping. I had this beyond weird sense that I was in the presence of something outside of our realm of existence. The figure spoke, facing away from me.
"I just want to live. I don't think it's too much to ask."
The voice of the figure was beyond terrifying, and it caught me off guard. I stuttered when I repeated, Show me your hands."
"They summoned me knowing what I was. This isn't my fault."
I pressed the tip of my gun to the back of his head. "Show me your hands, now." I was so scared that I was just prepared to shoot and ask questions later. The figure put 2 arms behind his back, still facing away from me. I had my hands full with a flashlight in one hand and the gun in the other. I really did wish I had waited for backup. For me to handcuff this figure, I'd either have to put down my flashlight or put down my gun. I decided on the flashlight. I set it down on the ground facing the figure. Most of the light was now scattered on the floor. I could barely see the figure. I slowly approached with my gun and handcuffs ready. I put one cuff on one of the hands and suddenly I was grabbed by 6 more arms from beneath the robe. I panicked and I tried to get a shot off when I realized that this figure had 8 arms. He was dragging me away. Even though I still had my gun in my hand, I still wasn't able to point it at the figure. He was too strong. I looked to see that the figure was now facing me. I had no idea what to do, other than scream for my life. I could feel myself being dragged as the thing started to climb the wall and onto the ceiling. The figure was so strong that all I could do was squirm. I realized at this point that my fate was sealed. A light then shined from below me as I realized that my partner came in as backup. I screamed to get his attention, and his light shined up at us. My partner then began firing, once accidentally hitting me in the shoulder. Enough shots must have landed since the creature dropped me from the ceiling. I fell about 10 feet, landing square on my back, knocking the air out of me. I laid there gasping for air as my partner continued to fire at the figure. Before I knew it, everything was calm again. The only thing I could hear was the woman under the stairs, still whimpering. My partner rushed over to check in on me. Despite being shot in the shoulder, I was okay. I tried to quickly get up and grab my flashlight. My adrenaline was still going from the situation. Once I got my flashlight, I scanned the basement for that creature. My partner then told me that as he was firing at the creature, that it managed to escape up the stairs. My partner took care of the girl, and I raced up the stairs. I went up the stairs and outside of the house. At that same time, backup was pulling in. As they pulled in, they were pointing off into the field. One of the officers exited the cruiser and said, "Did you see that thing crawling off into the field?" I nodded in response. "Yeah, that thing is responsible for what happened here." "What is it?" the officer asked. I looked at him with my fearful eyes and said, "I have no idea."
This happened to me in January of 2019 in western North Carolina, around the small town of Silva. I was participating in a week-long program to get certified as a first responder for wilderness first aid and rescue. I'm studying to become a forester, and it's important to know how to keep people alive in the woods when things go wrong. There are two primary locations in the complex: a classroom with some bathrooms, and a kitchen where we spent most of the day in class and ate meals, and a group of one-room cabins on top of a steep hill directly north of the classroom where we would sleep. An important thing to note about the cabins is the heating system. Each cabin has a small but powerful radiator in it that makes the cabin feel like a sauna if left on for too long. Since it was January in the Appalachians, it was pretty chilly outside at night, so the heat was needed. In order to strike balance between boiling in our beds and getting hypothermia, we would turn on the radiator and leave a window open so that warm and cold air could circulate and create a reasonable temperature. The radiator and the open window were at the front of the cabin next to the door, and my bed was directly across from the window. The incident happened on the 5th day, a Thursday, of my time there. My boyfriend and I, who was enrolled in the program with me, had settled down for the night in the cabin we shared with one other person. We had gone to sleep as normal and were sleeping soundly on two bunks that were pushed together so we could sleep next to each other. Sometime during the night, I was woken up by some shuffling on the other side of the room near the window. I heard my boyfriend say in a complaining voice, "Can't we close this window? I wake up feeling frozen." I woke up more and sat up in my bed groggily. I was about to answer him when I heard another voice say, "If we close the window, it'll get too hot and we'll wake up sweaty." I snapped awake and froze where I was sitting. The voice that had responded was my voice. There's something very strange and wrong in hearing your own voice repeated back at you. In the dark, I looked down next to me where I saw my boyfriend sleeping soundly. At this point, a mortal dread had a tight grip on my chest, and I forced myself to not move or even blink. I was focused intently on the place near the window, fearfully anticipating more of my own words. I heard more shuffling outside the window, and my same words were repeated. "If we close the window, it'll get too hot and we'll wake up sweaty," followed quickly by my boyfriend's voice again. "Can't we close this window? I wake up feeling frozen." Towards the end of the last repetition of my boyfriend's words, there seemed to be an unevenness in the enunciation, like raising and lowering the pitch slightly. I remained frozen in my bed, feeling my hand fall asleep in my propped up position. I sat there for what felt like 15 or 20 minutes, listening to whatever it was shuffle around in front of our window, separated from me by some odd 10 feet in window mesh. Eventually, the shuffling became more frequent, and a weird mumbling sound came from outside the window, with no real words being said, or none that I could make out. This particular behavior didn't last long before the shuffling sound moved to the left of the window to the door, where a scratching sound began to manifest. As the sound moved, I saw the silhouette of a medium height, 5'6", figure that moved in an uncanny way, like when a baby animal tries to walk for the first time, but isn't quite strong enough to stand up correctly. It sounded like someone was scraping some dry sticks against the wood of the door, not aggressively, but kind of like an impatient dog asking to be let in. The scratching slowly moved around the cabin, stopping when it reached the wall that I was closest to. My ears were strained to hear anything that might indicate further action, but all I could hear were footsteps on the dry leaves. The footsteps eventually moved away from the cabin and down the other side of the hill, and didn't return for the rest of the night. I stayed unmoving from my position for at least another half an hour, before my body readjusted itself slightly, letting blood flow back into my asleep limbs. I was wide awake until my boyfriend's and other roommates' alarm went off sometime before dawn to get ready for the day, which felt like maybe 2 hours, but I couldn't be certain because I didn't have a clock. My boyfriend was surprised that I was awake before him, as I'm typically a later sleeper, but I just told him his alarm woke me up and tried to act somewhat normal. We got up and got ready for our day, but I refused to leave the cabin until the sun began to peek over the mountains. For the rest of the week, I was on edge and felt like there were eyes on me whenever it was relatively dark out, though I'm not sure how much of that was raw paranoia. In the day following the incident at night, I had realized the lines that were repeated to me by the voice were a part of a conversation that my boyfriend and I had had earlier in the week, and I came to the conclusion that whatever it was had been outside our cabin and heard us talking. This scared me a great deal, as I also realized that it had likely been lurking there in the following nights as well without us realizing it, and might do so again for our remaining nights, though it ended up not coming back. I waited to tell my boyfriend about this until we had left the program, because he scares easy and was already a little wary of walking in the woods at night up to the cabins. It should be noted that I know this to not be a sleep paralysis experience, as I've had them before and they were nothing like this, not to mention I was able to move. I'm posting this here also as a means of asking for advice, in addition to getting it off my chest, as this winter I'll have to return to the same location to renew my certification, and I want to know as much as I can, so I can hopefully avoid another encounter. I'm a hunter. I like to hunt wild boar specifically. Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get a turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you that don't know, boar are a big problem in the United States. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to consist of 10 or more pigs. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, it's not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my state, it's illegal to hunt most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes, with the exception of boar and coyote. I'd been saving for a year, mostly fun money. It's hard to explain to your wife that a scope that cost literally twice as much as the rifle I was mounting it on was worth it, but I did it. I took it to a range and sighted it in. There was an area that was peppered with boar activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. It was easily accessible with my truck, with easy-to-find spots that I could set up in, that overlooked a large, easy-to-navigate clearing. The night started uneventful, mostly me tinkering with my new toy, cycling through the settings. I was a little impatient. I had spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season, and like I mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot I'd seen days earlier that probably wasn't much better than my first, but it gave me something to do and a new angle to look around with my scope. After an hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me. The spot doesn't have much animal activity at all, no rabbits or owls. The deer that I'd seen were hundreds of yards from me where I was. Why was this pocket of land so dead at night, but lively in the day? I'd set up around 10 p.m., and it was about 2 a.m. when I started to think about packing it up, maybe setting up a target before I left and taking some practice shots. I heard a crunch come from the direction I had came from before. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the brushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision. It's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in the Predator movies. I adjusted my range and zoomed in a little. I remember jolting a bit when I saw that it wasn't really a bear, it was a man. Because he was so low and hunched over, I thought I was looking at a young bear. Is that a game warden? It couldn't be. I would have seen the headlights coming up the road from where I was perched. And where could he have walked from? I was 30 miles away from anything and on public lands. I was about to call out when I adjusted my sights and noticed he was naked. No shoes, pants, or anything. I remember being disturbed by his movements, like a squirrel or something, twitchy and grabbing at the foliage, sniffing around and palming the tree. Was that my tree? The one I'd been leaning against earlier? The thought terrified me. Could he smell me? Then he did something I still have nightmares about today. He squatted and placed his hands in the dirt between his feet and stared straight up like a dog mid-howl. And I heard it, a voice coming from that direction, a very compelling female voice. "Help, I'm lost." There was a long pause, but neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sights were trained at the dirt in front of his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim directly at another person. It went against everything I'd been taught about firearms. Were they lost? Was this some guy that had gone crazy out here? Why was his voice so feminine? "Help, please, I can't walk," the voice called out. That's when I called bullshit. Not only could he walk, when I first saw him, he was traversing the land with ease for a naked person, so good I mistook him for a bear. That's a trap. This guy is trying to lure me to him with a damsel in distress routine. Luckily, the lack of activity before had caused me to pack up most of my gear. I think I may have left behind a hat and a sitting pad, but I didn't give a shit in that moment. I took my eyes off him for a moment to get my pack on. I buckled my chest strap and scrambled for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the same position, but his face was staring in my direction, and I swear I saw a smile. The thermal scope has an effect that makes animals' eyes appear white. How the hell had he heard me get up and put my gear on? He must have been easily 150 yards away. "Get lost," I screamed in that direction. He stood upright, and it hit me how tall and skinny he was. Easily 6 feet and very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction, and I instinctively sent a round sailing above his head into the tree line. He was freaky as hell, but he hadn't really threatened me. What would I tell the cops? I was unwilling and unready to shoot someone. He stopped dead in his tracks and hunched down on all fours. "The next one will fuck you up. Go away." He stayed on all fours, and this time, I had my sights trained on the center of him. His eyes were just above the grass, like a large cat or something. I was trying to stop my trembling, and knew that my voice had cracked a little on that last warning. I was terrified. That standoff probably only lasted a minute or two, maybe less, but it felt like forever. In an instant, he bolted left towards the tree line opposite the road. So much for not being able to walk. I could barely keep him in my scope, he was moving so fast. He disappeared into the brush, and I sent another bullet sailing high in his direction. I racked another round and tried to pocket that mag and swap for a fresh one, but I dropped it and didn't bother looking for it. I wasn't far from my truck, and I wanted to get out of there. I could hear him in the distance, yelling in this weird sound that could have been a laugh or a cry. I scrambled up the trail and arrived at my truck breathless. I tossed my gear into the cab, but kept the rifle in the passenger seat and sped off. For the longest time, I told that story from the perspective of having spotted some deranged crackhead living off the land like some kind of caveman. I reported it to Fish and Game, but all they did was scold me for hunting at night alone. Never received an update. It wasn't until I told this story at a camping trip that my nephew told me about wendigos, rakes, and skinwalkers. My story scared the piss out of him because the spot we were camping was technically the same forest I'd seen the bastard in, just 50 miles east of it. He was so spooked, his mom, my cousin, had to take him home. She was really pissed. I've gone down the rabbit hole on these scary stories. I'm not saying what I saw was definitely a wendigo or a skinwalker. I am saying that if such a thing exists, I may have dodged quite the bullet that night. Or maybe it was just a tweaker being Donnie Thornberry in the middle of the night. Either way, thought I'd share.
The Indigenous people of Australia have up to 75 different dialects, depending on the region where they come from. So the name of this being could be called something entirely different in the other dialects, but my local tribe called it the Kardachi men. Growing up in an outback town, you get a lot of freedom you take for granted, but that freedom could also get you in trouble. Big trouble. This occurred when I was about 11 years old, in my hometown. My Aboriginal friend and I were walking around town, bored out of our brains during school holidays. The rest of our friends had gone away for the holidays. So we decided to go fishing in a secret spot down by the old Aboriginal encampment, which was about 15 kilometers out of town. We headed around to the butchery to pick up some meat for Yabbies, to his house for rods and traps, and then my house for food, drinks, and a shovel. We planned to dig for worms out by the river. We got all the necessary supplies and headed out along the side of the highway. We were walking and talking and stuffing around when we finally got there. We headed down the sand road and came across a fence that blocked off the sacred land. There was a statue of some sort on the boundary, and my mate stopped and said a few words. He always said that his dad told him to do it, otherwise the bad spirits could see us. I told him that was silly and skipped it. We go down the back of the camp and walk on another kilometer or so and find our spot. All the noises of the bush were there, and there was a nice breeze blowing through the old ghost gums. We could see the fish jumping and knew we were in for a good day. We started digging around for worms and came up with a few big good ones and got to fishing. The day gets on and it turns out that we are terrible fishermen with rods, so we abandon them and get into the water to catch with our hands. Turns out I'm also terrible at that, but my mate ends up catching a decent sized yellow belly, so we keep her for eating and showing off. We hadn't kept an eye on the time, and before we knew it, the sun had set. My friend starts getting really nervous, saying that it's time to get out of there and we really need to leave. I ask why, and he says that it's really unsafe to be there after dark. I laugh, and at that exact moment, there is a huge splash in the water behind us. We both shit a little bit, but with our child bravery, we check it out and can't see a thing. Just ripples on top of the water. We dismiss it as a big fish and start to pack up our stuff to leave. By the time we start our march back, it is pitch black. We can barely see our hands in front of us and forgot to pack a torch, so we kind of fumble our way through the bush until our eyes adjusted. We are walking for about 20 minutes when we stop. We can hear heavy footsteps to our left about 15 meters away. We strain our hearing and the footsteps stop. We then realize that the bush is silent. No wind, nothing. Our eyes have adjusted to the dark, so we can kind of see where we're going, and we realize we have overshot the road by about half a kilometer, and whatever was making those footsteps was between us and the road. So we decide to push on and come out along the highway further up the road. That was a mistake. The footsteps kept persisting, sometimes closer and sometimes further away. I swear at times I could hear a low mumbling. I kept saying to my friend, but he told me to shut up and don't look back. "He can't see us," was what he kept saying. So I push on, my feeling getting more and more uneasy. The next second, we hear a loud crash come from our left on the small animal trail we were on, and my mate grabs me and pulls me off into the scrub and tells me to lay down. As we're laying there, we see a silhouette loom up to the path. It kind of has the outline of feathers on it and is ungodly tall and humanoid, but sickly thin. It is going from tree to tree, not very far from us, and is looking around, snapping its head and making a low mumbling sound as it moves. It was looking for us. It keeps moving around where we were standing, and suddenly stops and stoops, looking back down the path where we hear what could have been a kangaroo jump off into the bush. The being lets out an unearthly scream that hurts our ears and shoots off down the path faster than anything I've ever seen. I looked to my mate and whispered to him if he had just seen what I had. But when I looked, he had his head in his hands the whole time. He answered, "We're not allowed to look." His cheeks were all tear-stained, and then he whispered, "I told you he would see you." We waited for what felt like 2 hours, and bailed out of the bushes and ran the remaining distance to the town, losing our fish along the way and some of our stuff. We finally made it, and every time I tried to bring it up with him, he told me to shut my mouth or it would come back. So I eventually stopped trying. I haven't been able to sleep right since.
Okay. What the heck is that shrieking sound? My girlfriend was only mildly frustrated from the background noise. I looked at her with a concerned look, as there was not much that I could do to stop the frightful wailing coming from the backyard. "Sorry, my love," I told her through the phone, glancing up to my bedroom window across the room. "It's the neighbor's dog. There must be a rabbit or something in the yard. I'm sure it's nothing." "Well, it's kind of annoying me. All I could hear is that static shrieking through the phone. It's driving me crazy." Now forgive me if I make it sound like my girlfriend in any way dislikes dogs. That is not the case. She absolutely adores all animals, especially dogs. My neighbor's pet was simply growling in such a feral way that it could hardly be called a dog's bark. It sounded more akin to a wild animal fighting tooth and nails to save its life. The first night that I heard the howling outside my bedroom window, I was originally assuming that it was a wild coyote that had gotten hold of the neighbor's pet. However, the sounds did not cease as they should have. Hours have passed further into the night, and the dog continued to wail. This continued every night for nearly a week. The timing in which the animal would begin its horrendous screaming was not consistent, nor was the duration in which said screaming had lasted. I had contemplated speaking to the neighbor's son about their pet dog, but due to my poor social skills, I had decided against it. "Maybe I'll talk to my dad or one of the neighbors about it tomorrow morning and try to get some answers," I thought out loud. "You should, 'cause I don't want to hear it every night we call," she stated with such a tone in her voice that I got an impression the whole situation was my fault. Whether or not she intended to make me feel that way, she would never tell me. However, it was likely that she was not impressed with me ignoring the barking as a whole, rather than simply speaking with the neighbors about the animal's noise. The next morning, over an unhealthy breakfast of pancakes drowned in maple syrup, I had asked my father if he had heard the barking through the recent events. He confirmed that he had indeed heard the noise, and he had planned on asking the neighbors to keep their pets inside through the nights. It was clear to me that he had not slept as well as he had in the nights before. My father's eyes were sunken slightly, and barely visible dark circles had formed around them. His face seemed longer and more susceptible to frowning than his normal cheery look, and it was likely due to the fact that his eyes were so tired-looking. "That dang dog," he muttered before finishing his coffee and placing his mug into the sink. My father worked long days as a factory manager. He often had spent his spare time in the building itself to ensure the success of his employees, and more importantly, the future of his job. He had left that morning around 8 and likely wouldn't be home until 8 or so shortly after that night. His sleep schedule through the nights, where the dog's screeching was more apparent, was nearly non-existent. He had tasked me with the house chores through the days while he was away. One such chore was to visit the neighbor and, yes, you guessed it, politely ask for them to keep their pets inside, or at the very least, keep them quiet through the night, as he was unsure when he would be able to ask in person. I bid him farewell on his day, and finished all the other household chores I had been tasked with for the day before noon hour. After baking some homemade sweets and preparing dinner, I had thrown together a dessert package for the neighbors, hoping that this would lessen the blow of my complaint. I rehearsed what I had prepared to say while I walked down the driveway to the 5-minute dirt road to my neighbor's residence. The Whitmers were always kind people, from when I had remembered them. Mrs. Whitmer had passed away, too young as my father would say. Much like my mother, Mrs. Whitmer had left to go for a morning jog and had disappeared not 5 minutes from her own home. The difference between the two was that her body was found near the edge of a dense forest by authorities nearly 4 days later, and less than a half a mile from her own front door. The official cause of death was a bear attack, as the body was so horribly mangled and torn apart. Those 5.5 long years without his wife had mentally destroyed Mr. Whitmer. He had become a hollow, cranky old shell of a former man he was. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmer had always loved to be outside with their vast array of pets, but in the years following Mrs. Whitmer's death, Mr. Whitmer was very rarely seen outside. The one memory that stuck with me about Mrs. Whitmer was the one of her telling me various tales of her husband's sweet tooth as she baked me cookies in the evening that my father had led the search party for my mother on the day that she went missing. She had passed away a year after my mother, nearly to the day. I knocked on Mr. Whitmer's door, slightly praying that the tray of sweets at the very least would be enough to brighten his mood. After nearly 2 minutes, I had reached my hand out to knock again, but jumped back when I heard the lock violently turn and the door was pulled open.
What's this?"
he asked with a clear expression of confusion on his face. The old man was considerably more frail than the last time I had seen him, his face riddled with wrinkles, his hair thin and gray. He was slouching towards the open door with his arm holding the door open in such a manner that it appeared that he was using the door to hold himself up. I was afraid he would fall over at any moment. Hi. Hello, Mr. Whitmer," I stuttered out while trying desperately to remember the speech I had planned out. "I was doing some baking for my dad and thought you might want a tray of some homemade sweets and stuff." I awkwardly smiled while holding the tray out for him to take. A warm smile slowly crossed his face as he held up one hand to decline my offer.
No, it's quite thoughtful, son, but I haven't been able to eat anything like that in years. My sugar's too high, see?" he explained.
"Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmer. I didn't realize," I stammered, feeling my own embarrassment becoming clear on my face. But before I could say anything else, Mr. Whitmer gazed out his front door and towards my house. "Your new pup must be driving your father bonkers. He's awfully loud, ain't he?" "Huh? Oh, we don't have a new pup, Mr. Whitmer." I felt chills run down my spine. The gravity of the situation hadn't fully sunken in yet, but it was startling nonetheless. "That's why I came. I thought that maybe it was your dog." I trailed off. He slowly adjusted his gaze to me. I think in that moment, both the old man and I realized the same thing. I apologized to my neighbor for interrupting his day, to which he dismissed and welcomed me over any time. "Before you go," he started as I had half turned away from his front door. "You best stay inside after dark. Don't let your paw out if you can't help it, son." His face was pale, filled with fear, though he had obviously been trying to hide it. Clearly, this man had known more than he was willing to let on. I nodded and began towards my house. That evening was not unlike most evenings for me. I made and ate my dinner alone, prepared a plate for my father's late return,
and hand-washed the dishes that I had dirtied. I then made myself comfortable on the living room couch after popping in an old shark movie from the 70s in the DVD player. I wanted to be close to the front door to greet my father upon his return, hence why I chose to reside temporarily within the closest room to the front entrance, the living room. After a particular scene where the antagonist shark of the film jump-scared an old fishing boat, my father had unlocked the front door loudly. The creaky metal lock snapped open, lined up nearly perfectly with the jump scare that I nearly fell off the couch due to the startling sound my father made. My father entered the house, closing the door behind him as I regained my composure. I must have done a poor job of hiding my temporary fright as he asked me if I was alright as soon as he saw me. I then explained the scare that he gave me, to which we had a laugh together. He then took off his shoes, warmed his dinner, and joined me for the film's final. Having seen the movie so often, my father had quoted nearly every memorable line left in the film, and we remarked on the film's greatness as the credits began to roll. My father had began to feast while I searched through our old films for another classic to play. I looked back to my father as soon as I heard the faint squealing sounds coming from outside. He sat a few feet behind me in his lazy boy armchair, chewing slow and quietly as he listened. "Mr. Whitmer," I started, but my father only nodded as he finished chewing and finished my sentence for me. "He doesn't have a dog. I dropped by his place on my way home." I waited. I waited for my father to continue. I waited for my father to express how proud he was of me for making our neighbors sweets. I waited for my father to change the topic. I waited for my father to express his theories as to which he believed the barking to be. Finally, he spoke. "I don't want you going outside for a while, not if you could help it. I'm going to take some time off, and we're going to take a vacation soon." I looked to him with concern. He was raising more questions than he was answering, and I knew that if I was to pray, then he would only become stressed. My father rarely stresses, but when he does, he typically would not calm down for a few hours. I would not want him to lose any extra sleep over stress, as he was only getting a bare minimum amount of sleep anyways. My father and I indulged in my homemade sweets while trying to ignore the screaming animal outside. I had prayed that the sounds would eventually fade into background noise, but I could never get used to the wailing no matter how hard I tried. My father had ended up going up to bed shortly after 10 o'clock that evening. I had decided to text my girlfriend while I finished watching an 80s science fiction robot movie, to try to distract myself from the blood-curdling howling coming from the backyard. I did not want to tell my girlfriend about how the screeching had not stopped since our last phone call, due to the lack of answers I possessed as to what was creating the screeching. I was concerned that she would grow to worry for me. "Ever figure out why your neighbor's dog keeps barking every night?" Beside her text was a little yellow ponder emoji. You know, the one with the little index finger and the thumb stroking the chin of the circular head? That's the one. "No, not yet. It's probably just some wild animal scaring it. Or maybe it's the mating call of a fox or a coyote." I messaged her back and used the same thinking emoji that she had sent me. Now, feeling stressed about the mysterious and ever so consistent animal howling outside, I decided that I would partake in eating some potato chips to cure my anxious thoughts. I may have developed a bad habit of stress-eating junk food the night my mother went missing. Now, I am by no means obese. I am quite thin and I rarely eat such foods to begin with. However, when I do, I eat a lot at once. I stood up off the couch and paused the film with the television remote, with the soundtrack of the movie now on pause. It was at this point that I had suddenly realized that terror sounds from outside were no longer present. In fact, Nearly every sound was gone. It was so quiet that I was positive that I could hear the blood rushing from my ears. I heard my heart racing, throbbing in my chest. My slow and shallow breaths came out like blaring bomb sirens when compared to the stillness in that moment. I think it stopped. I texted my girlfriend after a long moment of standing still. I took one step towards the kitchen and froze when I heard a loud crashing sound coming from the basement. I jumped as I heard what sounded like several glass pans smashing to millions of pieces on the downstairs floor. My father had likely heard the loud crash too, as he was out of his room and down the stairway leading to the second floor in a matter of seconds, his double-barrel shotgun held firmly in hand. His knuckles were white as he clutched the gun and, with a satisfying click, he opened the gun and popped 2 ammunition shells into the barrel and popped the shotgun closed. I stood motionless, frozen, staring deep into my father's eyes. I was searching for comfort, for anything that would calm me down, anything to tell me that we would be okay and safe. I never found what I was looking for. "What the hell was that?" my father whispered under his breath as he stared behind me towards the basement door. He kept his eyes trained on that door and never once took his eyes off of it. He kept his ears alert and listened for any further sounds, and he kept his shotgun loaded and firmly in his grasp. I didn't reply to him. I simply stood still. After another minute or two of us locked in the situation, tied like puppets by the strings of fear, my father slowly loosened his grip on the gun and brought it down to his side in one hand. "Must just be a squirrel or..." Just as quickly as my father had started speaking, he was cut off by the horrible wailing again. The wailing was much louder now. The sound was not coming from outside. This time, the sound was coming from the basement, right below us. The window pans on the front door began to rattle, and the pictures were violently shaken off the walls. I dropped my phone and brought up my hands to cover my ears. I clenched my teeth and shut my eyes, but no matter how hard I tried, I was unable to prevent the sounds from reaching my ears. My palms grew sweaty and wet. No, not sweat. It was blood. My ears bled and rang. My head pounded. My vision blurred. The whole world began to rapidly spin around me. At some point, my father had grabbed my arm and led me outside in a panic. He led me directly to the deep blue pickup truck that he drove, and I climbed into the passenger seat while he went around to the driver's side and pulled himself inside. He gently tossed the shotgun to the back seat and gripped the steering wheel. After a moment of us both catching our breaths, he looked at me and analyzed my wounds. He too had a small trickle of blood coming from his ears. "Are you hurt?" he asked me breathlessly. "No, I'm fine," I stammered out. What was that thing?" I asked. "Well, I sure could tell you it ain't no bear," he started while he looked around for his keys. After a long moment, and his single deep inhale followed by him blowing out all of his air from his lungs aggressively through his mouth, he stated, "They're inside," as calmly as he could. I knew what he meant. We were trapped until one of us had decided to leave the temporary safety of the vehicle and head into the monster's new lair to retrieve our salvation. "I'm faster than you are," I began. "No," he said calmly, yet firmly. "I can fire the gun. You've shown me before." "I said no," my father yelled, his emotions taking control over him. "I've lost your mother to that thing, and I ain't losing you to it." It was apparent that he had instinctively regretted saying what he had just said, as he was likely trying to hide this from me for some time. I wondered if Mr. Whitmer had known about this creature as well. I waited a long while before I asked what had been on my mind. "Lost Mom to what, Dad?" He was silently sobbing for what felt like an eternity before he wiped his eyes and looked over at me. "The night that we lost her," he began slowly, seemingly second-guessing on whether or not he should tell me. "I led that search party through the woods, and eventually the sun began to set. We were going to pack it in for the night and look again come morning. However, there was a shriek, a small whimper, a cry of some sort, off in the distance. So a few of us go, flashlights drawn, and we take a look. Well, we turned from a few trees and we got to where it came from, but there ain't nothing there. We looked around and around, but still nothing. Then, one of the guys gets the bright idea to look up. I tell you, son, I prayed more in those 5 minutes than I ever have in my whole life." He paused for about a minute, his gaze fixed to the front door of the house, still wide open with the living room's orange lights spilling just outside the front door. The wailing had stopped again, which to me was not any more relief than if it had kept going. He stroked his scruffy chin before continuing. "Up in that tree, there was something big. It looked to be like some really muscular badger or maybe a wolverine or some sort of dog. But the thing that glowed from the flashlight's beam was your mother's favorite necklace. It was just there, dangling outside of its mouth. The thing was staring at us with its lifeless eyes, just pure black eyes. It let out its cry, the same way we've been hearing, just a single yelp, and it hopped off through the trees. That one was the baby, 'cause something real big, much bigger than it, was following. We ran like hell out of there. We never found that thing again. We went looking the next day. Didn't even find the necklace." If my father had told me this tale any other night, I would have thought that he was drunk the night he went searching for my mother all those years ago. However, given the current situation, I believed him. Of course, the police didn't believe us. They thought that we had encountered a raccoon in the trees or something else small, I suppose. As I gawked at my father, something caught my eye. Right outside his driver's side window were 2 small yellow circles simply hovering. I shifted my gaze and peered out his window as he kept talking. I didn't pick up on what he was saying. I only focused on the figure outside his window. I realized too late that the yellow orbs were actually the moon's reflection on the shiny black eyes of this creature. The being smashed its head through the window with ease, its massive hulking canine-like head over my father's lap and in front of his face. Both my father and I jumped from terror. The creature began violently shaking its massive head back and forth, opening and closing its maw. Its teeth were a deep yellow and looked more like shark's teeth. They were thick, triangular, and serrated, and the beast had countless rows of these teeth in its snout. Its fur was thick, jet black with matted patches of red. Blood formed around the top and bottom of the creature's head, from where it had cut itself on the broken glass, yet it seemed to be in no pain as it continued to shake its fierce head, snarling and biting the air. Its eyes looked fake. They were bulging orbs of shiny blackness, almost like that of a stuffed teddy bear's eyes. Between my screaming and my father kicking and pounding on the beast's head, he yelled for me to fire the shotgun into the creature's face. I spun around and tried to reach for the gun in the back seat. My fingertips managed to graze the gun's handle as a wet, warm splash of liquid drenched over my face, accompanied by a sickening, wet, squishy sound. My father screamed, and I wiped my eyes and spat out the copper-tasting fluid. With an extremely deep crunching, more of my father's pain hollering and the blood flying everywhere, The beast had pulled my father out the truck door window by his left arm and off into the night. Within seconds, I was alone, shaking in shock and in silence. I sobbed before slowly turning around and again reaching for the shotgun. I had not entirely processed what had just happened in those short few minutes as, when I retrieved the firearm, I aimed it out the window that the monster had dragged my father out of and whimpered about how I didn't want to shoot my dad and how the beast was moving too much to get a good shot. A series of quiet and fast knocking on my window jolted me back into reality. As I spun around, not sure of what to expect, Mr. Whitmer stood outside my door, face full of confusion. "Sonny, are you all right? Where's your paw?" he asked in his tired voice. I only screamed something about a direwolf going rogue, which, of course, had confused him even more so. Through my panic attempts to warn the old man, he had eventually understood the important part of the message and turned to go back towards his house. The poor old man hadn't made it 3 feet from my window before the canine creature had appeared seemingly out of nowhere and proceeded to maul the man. He didn't even scream while the attack happened, either because the attack startled him so badly that his heart gave out, or because the animal had attacked his head and neck area to begin with, and had killed him instantly. It viciously tore at the man and shook him around as his corpse was a new chewing toy for the oversized dog. An arm had flown off and cracked my window before leaving a thick streak of blood from the large crack towards the ground. I nearly threw up when I saw the cryptid holding the body in its mouth. Then it stood on its hind legs, placing its front paws on the torso of the old man's body, and separated the body in half from its waist. I closed my eyes and listened to the horrible sound of the man being reduced to ribbons only a few feet away from me. The sound of police sirens and the multicolored flashing lights had began enough to persuade the creature into hiding. I watched as it growled its deep growl and turned a full 180 degrees and sprinted into the dense forest behind my house. I sat there and sobbed, waiting for the officers to collect me. By the time a kind ambulance driver and young police officer had arrived at the truck door, I was dry heaving and on the verge of hyperventilating. There was no physical trauma done to me, so I sat in the back of the ambulance with one of the younger officers, and a blanket wrapped around me. She explained to me that there was a call from the neighbor's house, as the man who had placed the call was worried from all the commotion outside. God bless you, Mr. Whitmore, I thought to myself. I then explained to the young woman how the dog-like creature had used its screaming to try and deafen my father and I, about how the animal had broken into the house, and about how it dragged my father away, and lastly about the death of Mr. Whitmore. The remains of Mr. Whitmore had only been several long strips of flesh, and clothes, and a small puddle of blood with the odd bone fragment. His whole right arm was later recovered just under my father's pickup truck on the passenger side, while other officers drew their weapons and examined the surrounding area. I kept insisting to the woman that it was a dog that lived in the trees with rows and rows of teeth, with a horrible scream with its lifeless coal-black eyes. They recorded the entire incident as a bear attack, of course, and dismissed my story as shock-induced trauma. They found my father, still breathing however unconscious, in the backyard, near the tree line. His whole left arm from about the shoulder down was severely shredded. He and I were rushed to the hospital in the ambulance, and he underwent immediate surgery on his arm. They could only do as much in terms of nerve repair, however, he was able to keep his arm. He would go through several long months of therapy to regain nearly complete control over his arm and all his fingers. He cannot extend any finger in full length, nor can he touch the palm of his hand with his fingertips. However, he has gotten used to using his hand quite well.
He is still considerably weaker in that arm than in the other, though he was always more dominant in his right arm anyways. As for me, I have received extensive therapy for my daily nightmares. I've had the odd case of that creature returning to me in a state of sleep paralysis, which is a horror story on its own. The truly haunting part is that I haven't heard a single sound since the last attack a year ago. The haunting part is knowing that this creature is out there and still alive. The haunting part is finding out that these creatures go into hiding for about 50 weeks or so out of the year, and then they come out for 2. The haunting part is hearing the screaming coming from the forest last night, accompanied by another, much louder screaming. A much closer screaming.